Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is The Good Fight. Uh, my name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads, and I'll be the heard but not seen moderator for a debate on the death penalty. My guests today are Robert Blecker, who is a professor of criminal law at New York Law School and author of The Death of Punishment, Searching for Justice Among the Worst of the Worst, and David Dow, who is a professor of law at the University of Houston, the founder of the Texas Innocence Network, and the author of The Autobiography of an Execution. Uh, Robert, I'll put the first question to you. Why should America have the death penalty?
We need it because it's the only moral response in certain instances, given that there are some people who commit crimes with an attitude so heinous, so cruel, so callous, and the nature of our prison system and how we administer it, there's no moral alternative in certain respects. So in short, because some people deserve it. I mean, that's the simple and the brief answer.
David, what's your response to that?
My response is that some people probably do deserve to be removed from the earth. I just don't think that it's appropriately the responsibility of the state to be in the business of either deciding who those people are or implementing that punishment. I think that those are questions that are essentially theological, and that the state ought not to be involved in that. I think that in addition, the likelihood is that if we were to trust the state to make those types of very difficult and deep judgments, the likelihood is the state would get the wrong answer at least as often as it gets the right answer, and that's just a pragmatic reason for not having the state make judgment.
I'd like to, if I can, respond to the notion that it's a theological question. And I hear that a lot. I mean, that it's not for humans to intentionally kill those who don't immediately threaten us. Because let's not forget, when we execute somebody, we are killing somebody who poses no immediate threat to us and who is helpless, which is in and of itself very troubling. But you hear the objection that their judgment day will come sooner or later, and God will judge them. And if they deserve to be in hell, they'll be in hell. And of course, that depends upon what your beliefs are concerning an afterlife. But it seems to me common ground among all of us should be that we are committed to a separation of church and state, and that we are committed to justice. It is, after all, the second principle enunciated in the preamble to the United States Constitution. We tend to forget that. We all remember a more perfect union and common defense and promoting the general welfare, but justice is the second one that's specified. And so if we are really committed to a separation of church and state, it seems to me, then it's illegitimate for us to say that it's a theological question and that justice will be served in the hereafter. And one other comment about that. I've spent thousands of hours interviewing convicted killers inside maximum security prisons and on death rows in several states. And one of the questions I asked them is, do you believe in heaven or hell? And often the answer is yes. And I remember in two particular instances, I asked especially egregious and heinous killers who had just detailed what they had done, where do you expect to go? And I remember one of them said to me, well, they both did, but I'm thinking about one particularly, said, oh, I'm going to heaven. And I said, really? How are you getting there? And he explained to me that when he was a child and he went to church, he was taught that if you embraced Christ even in the last instant of your life, you go to heaven. He said, so I figure someday I'm going to be lying in a pool of blood, and then I will embrace Christ and I'll go to heaven. Now, I'm told that distorts church teaching, but that's not the point. The point is that that notion, accurate or not, consistent with his religious beliefs or not, sort of gave him comfort to go out and do some of the stuff he did. But so that the main response, though, to David, at least to the first part of his point, is it can't be a theological question solely if it's a question of justice. We are a secular society, at least when it comes to questions of justice, and have to be committed to doing our best to achieve it in this world.
I understand most of what Robert says. I just think that he's flat out wrong about what the responsibility of the state is in these circumstances, regardless of whether the Constitution uses the word justice in its preamble or doesn't. The role of the state in the criminal justice system is precisely to keep the rest of us safe. It's not to impose some notion of justice. Notions of justice vary from culture to culture, from neighborhood, certainly from state to state. And I think that they even vary within individuals. I just don't think the role of the state is to be implementing any grand theory or grand notion of justice. The role of the state is to punish people who do bad things for two reasons. Number one, to send a message to other people that if you do bad things, you're going to be punished, not because there's something that is morally obligatory about punishing people who do bad things, but rather because that's part of what is involved in keeping the rest of us safe. And then in some circumstances, wholly apart from whether you're sending any type of message, you just keep people locked up because those people are incorrigible and dangerous. And the only way to keep society safe is to keep them locked up. I think that's really the only obligation and, in fact, the only appropriate response of the state when it comes to the criminal justice system. And we simply don't need to be executing people in order to keep the rest of us safe.
Well, this is a very deep divide between us. And what David reveals, of course, is a utilitarian justification for punishment. And it's not one that's foreign or alien. In fact, it's one that's embraced by the members of the Departments of Corrections. If you look at the mission statements in the Department of Corrections in the United States, you will not find the word punishment in any one of them. No Department of Corrections in any state in the United States or the federal government includes the word punishment in their mission statement. What they do prominently include, and what more importantly, when you interview them and you ask them, what's your mission inside here? What are you trying to accomplish inside the prison? The very word that David used is the one that comes up most often. Safety. I'm here to keep the public safe from these prisoners. I'm here to keep the prisoners, although they call them inmates, I'm here to keep the inmates safe from each other, and I'm here to keep the staff safe from them. The net result of that, of course, is that concerns about safety, if you really want to keep the prison as safe as possible, then you should punish as little as possible, consistent with safety, and you should substitute the threat of the removal of privileges for the imposition of any unpleasantness, which is really the essence of punishment. But of course, the more you do that, the better you make the day-to-day life inside prison, the more you've severed an essential connection between the nature of the crime and, in my view, and in the view of any true retributivist, the nature of the response. You'll notice David talks about two things: incapacitation or safety, and also deterrence. Now, deterrence is one of the two principal justifications for punishment, and one of two that the United States Supreme Court has said is permissibly the basis for the death penalty, the general deterrence. I happen to be opposed to that. I think it's immoral to execute X in order to affect the behavior of Y. I think it violates an essential Kantian ethos where we treat people as ends in themselves and not means to our ends. But the other one, safety, that he emphasizes, the United States Supreme Court has declared the Constitution does not permit as the basis for a death penalty. And I agree with that. That is, we have an obligation and a capacity to design and administer prisons in such a way as to keep us safe. It is not a sufficient justification, in my view, to kill a fellow human being on the grounds that he poses such a threat to us once we have him captured, tried, and convicted and sentenced, that he continues to pose such a potential future threat that we have to kill him. That's not a sufficient moral justification. The only moral justification is on the basis of the past, of what he did and the attitude with which he did it. And David entirely excludes that. And once you do, in my view, you have excluded the only legitimate basis for the death penalty itself.
Well, you know, at least we're finding that we both disagree about justifying capital punishment on the basis of which that it is in fact justified in virtually every jurisdiction that uses it. I simply think that the criminal justice system is not built remotely on the values that Robert thinks are important, and I don't even disagree that they're important values. I simply think that they are not appropriate values in the criminal justice system that the state runs.
You know, it's very interesting because if you look at the public opinion polls which try to get to why people support the death penalty, overwhelmingly, the popular support for the death penalty comes on the basis that some people deserve it. So retribution itself is the primary justification that the people embrace. And so it's odd for me to hear David expound that it is an illegitimate justification and it's not the business of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just interrupt for a second, I think that Robert is absolutely right if you're talking about surveying the average citizen and probing that citizen's reasons for either supporting or rejecting the appropriateness of the death penalty. I think that, interestingly, there's a very significant divide between what animates popular opinion and what animates policymakers, and for that matter, those who are in charge of implementing policy, which are prison officials. And one of the peculiarities of looking to the popular basis for having the death penalty is that you end up with a lot of people saying, in response to like something what happened in Oklahoma the week before last, you have people say, oh, I don't really care that Clayton Lockett suffered because he didn't suffer as much as his victim did. And so to me, that simply reveals the fallacy of saying that we're going to build a criminal justice rationale on top of what the average citizen thinks somebody who commits murder deserves. I think that the average citizen is generally somebody who has not spent her or his entire life immersed in Kant or immersed in philosophy the way Professor Blecker has. I think that the average citizen is not somebody who has intimate familiarity with how prisons are operated, with why we have a criminal justice system. The average citizen understands that the reason that we put people in prison is to keep society safe. But beyond that, if you're going to look to the reasons that the average citizens support the death penalty as either an appropriate punishment or oppose the death penalty as an inappropriate punishment, I don't think that you're going to find any sophisticated moral rationale. You're going to have people saying, I think that we should kill people because they killed somebody. And you're not going to end up with the sort of very fine-grained analysis and fine-grained separation that Professor Blecker wants to do. What Professor Blecker wants to do is he wants to say, here you have 100 people who commit murder. And I, Professor Blecker, think that there are going to be 2, 3, 4 of those people whose actions were so heinous, were so immoral, that those are the people who deserve to be executed. And that is not the same type of fine-grained analysis you're going to get from death penalty supporters. The death penalty supporters who are invoking the rationale that Professor Blecker is talking about are going to say 100 people killed somebody, 100 people should be killed. And so I think that it's simply a fallacious move for Professor Blecker to look at the reasons that the public supports the death penalty and say in any fashion that those align with his much more sophisticated justification for capital punishment.
No, I think that misstates it. The fact is, and that's a common move, which is to somehow equate support with the death penalty by and large with ignorance or rough-hewn notions and not proportional notions of justice. You point to the fact that if you survey the prison administrations and administrators, they won't necessarily support the death penalty, and you're right. But they're, in a sense, the last people we should be looking to for our guidance here, because their view is to keep the institution on low. They look to their mission statement for their mission, and since their mission statement doesn't talk about punishment and justice, they don't talk about punishment and justice, and they want to go home at night, and so they contribute to there are several radical separations going on here, all of which undermine a commitment to true justice and moral justice. One of them is the separation between the nature of the crime and the actual experience of the punishment. Almost to a person, and I've interviewed dozens and dozens of corrections officers from the very top to the line officers, they say with almost one voice, it's none of my business what a guy did out there. I only care about how he acts in here. And so, therefore, we design our prisons and we administer our prisons essentially to sever the nature of the crime from the experience of the punishment, so that any commitment to basic justice, which is that the punishment should fit the crime, does not particularly get supported by prison administration.
I'm not remotely going to defend the operation of the prison system, and nor do I think that it's terribly important whether prison officials support or oppose the death penalty. The only point that I was trying to emphasize was that on the one hand, Robert wants to say the reason that the public supports the death penalty is for this same retributive notion that he is identifying, namely that some people who kill deserve to die. And what I'm emphasizing is that in Robert's case, he doesn't actually believe that everybody who kills deserves to die. He is going to conduct a very fine-grained analysis of what type of crime those people actually committed, what he thinks that it reveals about their interior state, what it reveals about their interior depravity. And when he says that the reason that the public supports the death penalty is for the same reason that he does, that's simply wrong. The public supports the death penalty because of this very crude idea that people who kill should be killed. And it's absolutely true that the point that I'm making about the public being generally ignorant is a point that's been made since the death penalty returned to the United States in 1976. I don't say that as a criticism of the public. The public, you can go across campus here at the University of Houston and walk into a lab run by a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and that is somebody who's also ignorant about the way the criminal justice system works. It's not a point about the individual. It's simply a point about the extent to which ordinary everyday citizens understand the operations of the criminal justice system. And the reality is they don't. Prisons in most states are out in the middle of nowhere, far away from big cities. The people who are incarcerated in prison are not typically people who are on university campuses. They're not people who are typically in the social circles for your average middle-class family. And so when I say that the typical American is ignorant about the way the death penalty system works, I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all. I simply mean that it is something that is foreign. And maybe instead of saying ignorant about, what I should really say is that the way the death penalty system works is something that is foreign to most Americans, and that if it were less foreign to most Americans, I am confident that they would be much less sanguine about the utility and the moral defensibility of the death penalty system.
Well, just to show how you're wrong in two respects, first of all, there is a common intuition that unites most of us supporters of the death penalty as to who deserves it. Now, you're quite right that I've taken 25 years to try to refine the categories in order to more nearly appropriately label the worst of the worst of the worst and figure out who they are. But what I've discovered in this journey is that the essential intuitions of the public are pretty close. Now, they depart in certain respects, but they're pretty close to what my more refined intuitions may be based upon the experience of the killers themselves and the alternative fate that they suffer. For example, a person who rapes and then murders a child, all things equal, deserves to die. That is an intuition that is shared by the vast majority of the American public. Terrorists, mass murderers, serial killers, sadistic killers, these are all categories, hired killers, hired assassins. These are categories that are widely shared as the worst of the worst of the worst. It doesn't take any great education or acquaintance with the criminal justice system to feel certain that these are the worst of the worst of the worst.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the second point would be that you say that the reaction of the American public is based either on ignorance or and lack of information about the particularities. Well, the polls, for example, the Gallup poll, which the media trumpeted, which showed that the support for the death penalty is the lowest in 40 years because it had dropped to 60% approval, was a response to the question, are you in favor of the death penalty for someone who commits murder? Now, as you would rightfully respond, knowing me and my position, more often than not, I'm not in favor of the death penalty for someone who commits murder, and therefore I would be very troubled to answer that question in a yes or no way, and might even say no, which would then characterize me as an abolitionist. But that understates the support. When you give people the particularities of a situation, like the Boston Marathon bombing, or if we get talking about Oklahoma, let's talk a little bit more. I mean, you mentioned Lockett and what he did, but let's talk about the details of what Lockett did and why the American public responds by saying, in large measure, I don't care if he suffered pain. And you suggest that's an ignorant response. Well, join me with the ignorant. I mean, I care. We can't have a policy that's designed to have him suffer pain. It would violate the Eighth Amendment and be torture. But the fact that this guy may have, and we don't even know it for certain, he may have been unconscious during all of it, as what happened apparently with McGuire in Ohio a couple of months earlier. But just to return to the main point, the intuitions of the American public are that some people deserve it, and the intuitions are reflected that murder is too broad a category, and it's reflected clearly by the fact that when you give the particularities of certain particularly heinous and egregious crimes, the registered support for the death penalty goes up. So that suggests, it seems to me, unarguably, that the American public can distinguish between the very worst murders and the ones that are just ordinary murders.
You might think that that's true, Robert, but I think that we are clearly having two different conversations here. And one is about what you idealize as a perfect death penalty regime, and the other is the death penalty regime that we actually have. Since we started executing people again in the United States in 1977, slightly more than 70% of the people who've been executed have been executed for felony murder. Now, I happen to know that your general view is that felony murder is not a sufficient basis for carrying out an execution. But the fact that more than 70% of the people who've been executed for committing a felony murder certainly suggests that your attempt to ally your own moral intuitions with the moral intuitions that underlie the death penalty regime that we actually have is really incorrect. The moral intuitions that underlie the death penalty system that we actually have are not the same ones that you're talking about. I mean, it might be true that 90% of the people in the U.S. or 80% or 70%, I don't know what the figure is, but it's going to be some big number, think that we ought to execute terrorists, think that we ought to execute serial killers, think that we ought to execute torturers. That might all be true. But the reality is that the largest percentage of people who we've actually executed have been people who didn't commit a crime that falls into any of those categories. And what that tells me is that people also support a much broader application of the death penalty. And when I talk about the death penalty system being foreign to people, and I'm going to get away from the notion of ignorance because I think foreign is actually better. What I mean by that is that the way the system actually works, the way that it makes a selection about who's going to be put to death and who isn't, the way that it actually assesses the available alternative punishments are all issues that I think most people making a moral calculation would want to know something about, but all of those things are foreign to people who actually have to make the judgment.
Two things about that. Number one, you're absolutely right about felony murder, as you know. Although even that statement is slightly too broad, because those who were executed for committing a rape murder may have committed felony murder. My view is, as you know, that felony murder as a category of crime is way too broad. It shouldn't be an aggravating circumstance, especially in the common case of robbery or burglary, that it's a mistaken moral notion to assume that someone who kills in the course of and in furtherance of a robbery killed from a pecuniary motive, which should be an aggravating circumstance. But robbers who kill are robbing from a pecuniary motive and often do not kill from a pecuniary motive. So you're quite right to point out that that category is way too broad. It's put more people on death row than any other, and my view is it should be abolished. But rape, of course, should be retained as an aggravating circumstance, not because it's a felony, but because it's torture. And so you're right. It is too broad, and it needs to be refined. In your own state, Texas executes on the basis, in part, for an aggravating circumstance of future dangerousness. I think that's also a moral mistake. I think we have the ability and obligation to construct prisons to render people no longer a danger, and that shouldn't give us the adequate way of reaching the worst of the worst of the worst. But having said that, and acknowledging that people are uninformed, or you say foreign, let's say uninformed rather than ignorant, what they're also uninformed about is the alternative to the death penalty, which is life or life without parole. And what they're uninformed about is the quality of life that people actually experience in the prison. I mean, that's the whole premise of the death of punishment, which is that we are rejecting punishment itself as a morally good, when necessary, response to crime. And if you really probe the daily life in punishment, if we don't have a death penalty, and you ask, well, what's the alternative? And the way that the prisons are being administered today, it's privileges, not punishments. And so if given the choice, I think the informed American public, even those presently who are opposed to the death penalty, say, well, the reason I'm against the death penalty is because it's not punishment enough. I want him to suffer every day with a life in prison. Well, he doesn't suffer every day with a life in prison. And if the American public were better informed as to what the quality of life is day to day for those who serve life, I think support for the death penalty would actually increase if the American public were better informed rather than decrease, as you suggest.
I mean, I hardly know what to say to that. I mean, the reports in I know that you have been all over the place interviewing prisoners, inside prisons. And are you right in suggesting that modern contemporary prisons are not medieval dungeons? Absolutely right. Absolutely. You are absolutely 100% right, 100% correct about that. I mean, but the notion that anybody who is currently living in a house or an apartment, who can leave and come when she or he wants, who gets to decide what time, he wants to eat, gets to cook his meals, gets to look for a job, work if he wants to, not work if he doesn't want to. I mean, the notion that anybody would prefer life in prison, the notion that anybody would not regard that as a very severe and dramatic curtailment of liberty is, I just think, preposterous. I mean, the big news in Texas lately on prisons is, are we finally going to start supplying air conditioning in prisons, because it gets to be, 135, 140 degrees in the cells in the summertime in most of the prisons in Texas, and the legislature doesn't want to retrofit all the prisons to have air conditioning because it's going to cost too much. I mean, the idea that this is some comfortable life, that it's a life of privilege, is, I think, simply wrong. Now, is it not as harsh, not as oppressive as some people might want? Well, maybe. And I think that, Robert, you identified one of the reasons for that about 10 minutes ago when you said that it is not to the benefit of prison officials to have prisoners subjected to conditions that are going to really ratchet up the tensions between the corrections officers and the prisoners. So there's a whole lot of inside prison management that is responsible for what type of benefits, or if you want to call them privileges, fine, what kind of benefits or privileges prisoners get and what they don't. But I think suggesting that it is by any stretch of the imagination a comfortable or pleasant life is irresponsibly misleading.
Well, let's explore that a little bit. In terms of no air conditioning, we allow our innocent poor to live without air conditioning, and yet we'll be more concerned to supply air conditioning to someone who has raped and murdered a child than we are to someone who is working his ass off in order to better the lives of himself or his family. Our prisons should never be constructed to have a lifestyle that is better than what we will tolerate for our innocent poor.
I
absolutely
agree with you. I absolutely agree with you that we don't.
So before we install the air conditioning, install the air conditioners in our prisons, let's install the air conditioners in our housing projects.
I'm fine with that. I wasn't by any means suggesting that we ought to be improving the lives of prisoners before we improve the lives of poor law-abiding citizens. I wasn't suggesting that at all. I think we absolutely ought to do that. All that I'm saying is that the suggestion that people inside prison are living great, privileged, comfortable, cushy lives is simply wrong. They might be better.
It's not, David.
Robert, look, they might be better than somebody who thinks that those people ought to suffer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They might be better than that person thinks, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination a comfortable or privileged life.
Well, it's privilege relative. It's privilege relative to the poorest members of our society who are not committing these heinous crimes. But that's perverse.
That is perverse.
It's fundamentally, and furthermore, not only that, the degree to which it's privileged has become completely disconnected from the nature of the crime to which it's supposed to be a response. That is to say, those, for example, who commit absolutely the worst crimes, those who prey on the helpless, those who rape and murder children, are typically cowards. And once they're captured, they become subordinate to state power. They become pussycats. And once they're in prison, they become very reliable inmates. And they become ones which, therefore, get the best privileges inside prison. So in prisons that I've gone to, you will find people who committed the absolutely most despicable, heinous crimes being given the most privileges inside, having the best jobs, the most recreation, being the ones put in trusted positions, watching color television, watching first run movies, having a commissary. I mean, I've documented all this stuff. Having commissary and commissary items that you wouldn't believe in terms of they're never seeing the light of day. They sell suntan lotion with an SPF factor of 30. I've got convicted killers, a video of convicted killers playing softball, with line base pads because we haven't veered off anything. This is the alternative to the death penalty.
We have veered off the
This is the alternative, David. This is what they are experiencing.
We've veered off the entire
It's not veering off.
question of whether the death penalty is an appropriate moral response. I don't disagree with you for a minute that our society ought to be making sure that people who do not have enough money to buy food, to have air conditioning, to have health insurance, ought to have all those things. I think that kids ought to have laptops, even if their parents can't afford it. I think society ought to do a much better job of taking care of poor people who follow the law, who are law-abiding. I agree with you 100% on that. I agree with you that there may be some prisoners who are privileged or receive, I don't want to say privileged, there may be some prisoners who are receiving things that I myself don't think that they ought to be receiving. But you know what? I'm not the expert on making the judgment call about why they're receiving that. Those judgments are usually made by prison officials, and prison officials might have good reasons, might have bad reasons for making those judgments. Fine, we can agree on all of those things or disagree on some smaller number of them. But to me, that is all entirely beside the point. The question to me, I think that is all entirely besides the point. I don't really know whether prison officials have veered too far from what you think they ought to be doing, and I don't really know if you're the one who ought to be questioning the judgment of prison officials in terms of how they manage the interior of prisoners. I thought that what we were talking about is whether it is appropriate for society to make the judgment about whether what a very small percentage of murderers do is so opprobrious that we're going to put them to death, as opposed to putting them in prison, and then we can have a separate conversation later on about what those prison conditions ought to be. But I don't think that you're suggesting, or maybe I've misunderstood what you've been telling me for the last 10 years, I don't think that you're suggesting that the reason that we need to execute people is because otherwise they're going to live some great cushy life in prison. You're suggesting that we ought to execute them no matter what the alternative life in prison would be.
It becomes less morally imperative to execute them if the punishment that they would face in lieu of execution were one that they deserve.
Oh, okay. Well, then you don't.
But if the punishment, because
oh, well, okay.
No, I'm in favor of the death penalty, David. Don't make no mistake about it. Sometimes death is the only appropriate response. But we're talking, you want to talk realism, and I understand that, and I appreciate that. So let's look at what's actually happening, and let's look at what's being given as the alternative. You say I shouldn't go into prison management, but if you talk to the managers in the prisons, this most succinct and accurate statement of what's going on in the prisons was given to me by the warden's assistant in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Her name was Lee Mann, and she said, "We make it easy for them because it's easy for us when it's easy for them." They act consistently with their mission statement. Their mission statement is safety. Right. Their mission statement is also for those whom they're going to release, the ability to reintegrate and rehabilitation. But their mission statement is not punishment. So they are acting appropriate to their mission statement. So they're the last people we've got to consult about justice. Well, remember that word, justice.
I mean, if the way that you're going to find support for your argument is to rely on the opinion of people who agree with you, then you're going to win the debate if the only people whose opinion you're going to take into consideration are the people who agree with you. What I'm suggesting is that the function of
I take your opinion very seriously
is to keep society safe. That's the function of prisons, and
that's a function.
That is a
function, not the function.
That is a function of prisons, and part of that is recognizing that most people who go into prison are going to come out of prison. They're not going to be lifers. And so part of the mission of the prison is to make sure that when those people come out, society is still safe. They don't wash their hands of the prisoners when the prisoners come back into society, because if they do that, they haven't done their job, which is to keep society safe. And if that forward-looking objective of theirs requires that they treat prisoners in a way that you think is less harsh or less brutal than it ought to be, then I don't really know what the answer to that is. I will say that if your argument
I
that the
do.
moral force for the death penalty declines if the conditions in prison are appropriately harsh, gosh, I mean, maybe we don't really need to be executing anybody at all in prison, because at least the prisoners on death row in Texas are kept in conditions that, I mean, I think that you would agree are pretty appropriately harsh, and the type of conditions that people who do bad and immoral things ought to be subjected to. I mean, these aren't people who have color TVs. They don't have any TVs at all. And these aren't people who have group exercise. And these aren't people who have work privileges. So maybe the conditions that death row inmates are kept under in Texas is sufficiently harsh that you would agree that we don't even need to execute any of those people.
Well, I've not been on death row in Texas, but I have been on death row in Oklahoma, a neighboring state, and I can tell you, and I have the video to prove it, that they do engage in communal rec, and they do watch television. Now, you say, you ask, what's the solution in part? Well, the solution is to have not only the length of the sentence, the solution given the fact that we want to release most of these people and we have to prepare them to reintegrate into society, and I fully agree with you. The solution, though, is to have the sentence reflected, the seriousness of the sentence, not only reflected by the length. The question is not only how long, it's how long. That is, it's not just will they live or will they die, but how will they live until they die. So if we had a criminal justice system that was designed and administered to reflect the day-to-day quality of life upon the nature of the crime that was committed, so that those people who commit the most heinous and despicable crimes would be serving their time in a separate prison or a separate prison wing under the harshest conditions that the United States Constitution allowed, they would not be getting good food. They would be eating Nutriloaf, which is a nutritionally complete but absolutely tasteless patty, and they would not ever be playing. Someone who rapes and murders a child should never play softball. He should never be playing anything. If we had those kinds of conditions so that he was punished every day, virtually all day, had exercise but never play, then you're right. The unique nature of the death penalty, its discontinuity with life itself, and the life as experienced by prisoners, would be to some degree diminished, and therefore the moral imperative to have it would be to some degree diminished. And as a practical matter, much of the support for the death penalty would be diminished, although I would still be among those who say that life and death are different, and that even the quality of life, as harsh as it can be, that the Constitution allows, would be insufficient for some people who would still deserve to die and for whom we'd still have an obligation.
All right, so I know that you're a busy man, and the last thing you need is for somebody like me to add to your research agenda. But at some point when you get a breather in your research life, here's a little survey that you could conduct. You could go find people who have been released from prison, and I'll let you cherry pick whatever state you want to go to. You could cherry pick the state that you think has the most overly privileged prison conditions. And you go find people who have been released from prison who are serving time in those posh accommodations, and you just ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy would they be to go back? And I think that will be the best data for whether life on the outside is significantly worse or just a little bit worse than life on the inside. And if we could figure out a way to scale it, then you and I could make a bet. And I will bet you that 90% of the people who you interview will be answering that no way, no how do they want to go back.
But that begs the question. The question is not, is prison better than life on the outside? The question is prison sufficiently bad to constitute a moral response to the crime that's been committed? I readily grant you that most people would prefer to be outside prison than inside prison. Although, by the way, I have conducted somewhat of that survey, or at least it conducts itself. In Lorton, which I spent several years, the prison population would swell in late fall and early winter because the homeless on the Washington, D.C. streets would much prefer to serve short sentences inside Lorton and then be released where they'd have 3 hots and a cot than be out on the streets. So I mean, they would intentionally commit relatively trivial crimes in order to end up there. But by and large, I readily grant your point that most prisoners would prefer to be free, but that doesn't answer the question of whether prison is an adequate response so that we can jettison the death penalty because it's a severe enough response so that the punishment fits the crime. And that's why this whole discussion is relevant to the death penalty, because we're both committed, I take it, to having the punishment fit the crime as the essence of justice.
If I could break in, Robert, in 2013, 39 people were executed in the United States. Under your ideal system, is that an appropriate number, or is that too few? Is that too many?
It's way too few, but there are way too many people on death row. And there, David's point is absolutely irrefutable and entirely correct, which is we have condemned to die many people who, under the claim that they are the worst of the worst of the worst, who do not deserve to die. So we are executing too few and we are condemning too many. Many too many. But by the way, let me just point out that, and this is also, it seems to be vital to this discussion. I mean, David opposes retribution, and I respect that, fundamentally disagree with it, but he's got plenty of company. Although I do probably represent the majority of people who intuitively think that a justification for punishment is that some people deserve it, regardless of what good it will do in the future. But the other side of being a retributivist, of course, is to being just as opposed to over-punishing as we are supportive of adequately punishing. I mean, the ACLU recently issued a report that detailed the lives of more than 100 of some 3,100 people who are serving life without parole for nonviolent crimes. The Attorney General just announced the Clemency Initiative. I wholeheartedly support that. I think it's obscene that we are indiscriminately punishing to the degree we are, both in the nature of the day-to-day experience inside the prison and in the length of the prison sentences. So what I'm advocating, I mean, the death penalty is a very important part, but it's only one part of a more morally responsive system of criminal justice that allocates punishment on the basis of the crime.
I wonder if you could both respond to the racial disparities in executions, and studies have shown that the most reliable predictor of whether someone will be sentenced to death is the race of the victim.
No studies have shown that I know of. That the most reliable indicator is the race of the victim. No, what the studies have shown is that a person who kills a black victim is much less likely to be condemned to die than a person who kills a white victim. But the most reliable predictors of the death penalty have to do with the number of victims, the rape of a victim, child victims, and terrorism. Those are the most predictable. But
I think that if you're looking at crimes with, I think that at some level y'all aren't really disagreeing, because Robert is right that there are characteristics of crime that are going to be most responsible for narrowing the universe of people who are those who are targeted for death. And then within that universe, once you define the universe, however you're going to define it, typically on the basis of what the nature of the crime was, as Robert is suggesting, there are a cluster of variables that can be identified that tend to indicate which people are most likely to receive death, and they are exactly what you would expect. They, in reverse order of importance, the race of the bad guy, the socioeconomic status of the bad guy, and the characteristics of the victim. And among those characteristics are the color of the victim. But color of the victim is not the only one. Age of the victim matters, whether very young or very old. Gender of the victim matters. People who kill women are more likely to receive the death penalty than people who receive men. But as I tell the students in my death penalty class, if you are going to commit murder and you want to minimize the likelihood that you're going to get sentenced to death, you want to be wealthy because you want to be able to hire a great lawyer and a great investigative team. You would rather be white than black, and you would rather kill a person of color than a white victim. And if you have those three characteristics operating together, then you're probably not going to be sentenced to death. And one of the points that I want to make, that I think that, Aryeh, your question about race really calls attention to is the extent to which much of the disagreement that Robert and I have generally and have been exhibiting today is a disagreement that, at least in my view, operates at a pretty high level of theory. And that when you get down to the question of how the death penalty system that we have in America is actually working, even if you could articulate some sophisticated justification for a death penalty regime, it simply wouldn't be the death penalty regime that we have in any state in the United States today. Texas, has executed 500 people since the death penalty resumed. And Texas executed its first person in the modern death penalty era in 1980. And it was not until 20 years later, 19 years later, 1999, that Texas finally sent to death row a white murderer whose only victim was a black victim. Now that's pretty astonishing because blacks and whites are victims of homicide in about equal numbers. And yet if you look at the people who have been executed, not only in Texas, but throughout the United States since the death penalty resumed in 1977, nearly 80% of them have been executed for killing a white victim. That's a pretty astonishing statistic, and I think that it reveals what is simply a truism, which is that we still have a race problem in the United States, and that race problem is at its most acute in the criminal justice system. And so if you're talking about having some, what I think of as very sophisticated justification for the death penalty regime, like the one that Professor Blecker is articulating, once you have articulated that justification, if you try to find the contact points between that theory that justifies the death penalty and the death penalty system that we actually have in the United States, the contact points that you will find will be very, very, very few.
Well, I want to respond to that in terms of race. First, let me acknowledge, as everyone should acknowledge, and as we as a culture should never forget, that the death penalty was used as a tool, a racist tool, especially in the context of rape of white women by black men. We have a history of racism and the death penalty, and a shameful history of the death penalty in that. Secondly, if you, what David said, of course, is true largely, but pay careful attention. The category of white killers of blacks is by far the rarest of the four. There is no substantial evidence, and in fact, in the famous Baldus study, the evidence was slightly to the contrary, that all other things equal, a white is more likely to escape the death penalty under the same set of circumstances than is a black defendant. Most killings are same-race killings, the black on black and white on white. And the standard that you hear, the standard statement that you hear, but you didn't hear it from David, but the standard statement that you hear is that the disparity in black versus white race of victim shows that we devalue black life. And I don't think that that's fair or accurate. And Professor Dow didn't make that statement, but that's what's commonly made. Because in my experience, and I spent years inside Lorton Prison, which was the nation's only all-black prison system in the United States when I was there, interviewing these guys and interviewing their families, it turns out that prosecutors often consult the families of the victims. And since most killings are same-race killings, black on black or white on white, when there's a black victim, there's generally a black killer. And so, and the reverse, of course. So when the prosecutor asks the victim's family, do you think we should go deaf? Not that that binds the prosecutor, but it may help inform her or his decision. Often these killings come out of the streets, out of gangs, out of drugs, and the killer's family, being black, recognizes and appreciates the fact that there, but for fortune, their child who's now dead could just as easily be defendant as victim. And rather than waste more life from their perspective and continue the tragedy, they say, no, don't. That doesn't show that they devalue black life. That shows that they continue to value black life, including the life of the killer. Race does, it seems to me, appear in a very significant and disturbing way, but in two ways, and ways that are rarely discussed. Number one is in the definition of the death penalty. David mentioned earlier about felony murder, and he's absolutely right. I mean, robbery is a class-based crime to some great degree, and it correlates with race. So that the felony murder aggravator, the robbery aggravator, as Justice Stevens, who's now an opponent of the death penalty, but what was the chief architect of the death penalty jurisprudence in the modern era, points out, as Justice Stevens points out, if we limit the death penalty to truly the worst of the worst of the worst, the racial disparity radically decreases. So that if we eliminated the robbery murder and the burglary murder aggravator, you would see a significantly diminished racial effect. Secondly, and this is in a way the most troubling, the studies show that there is a discriminatory effect on David said skin color, and he's right, but let's not just associate color with being African American or being Caucasian. It's the hue and the tone. That is to say, studies show that defendants who are darker skinned black with stereotypically African American features will be treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than lighter skinned defendants who may still qualify as being black or African American. That is race, and by the way, that's true in the black community as well as the white community. And that is terribly disturbing and is racism to the core. He points out that the racial problem pervades the criminal justice system, and it does to some significant degree, but it's least in effect in the death penalty regime, where there is the greatest consciousness of race and race bias. And finally, the last thing I would say is that much of that disparity between the white victim and the black victim effect disappears when you realize that the county is the unit of decision making, as David knows better than anyone, having spent so much of his career as a prominent, one of the truly great capital defense attorneys in a county in Texas that had more than anywhere else. The county is the relevant unit, and the racial disparity between white victim and black victim tends to disappear, or at least be greatly diminished within a county. That disparity is really county by county, so that white counties, largely white counties, with white victims and white prosecutors and larger budgets and a more significant prospect of success with the death penalty will go for it more often, whereas minority counties with less support for it will tend to go for it less often. The studies do not show a huge, or even a significant in most cases, racial effect within a county, but rather county by county. So it's a question as much of geography as it is of race there.
We're coming towards the end of our time. On the good fight, we try to find common ground. I think we found some already. You both agreed that murder alone is not a reason for a death sentence. And I think you agree that there are currently too many aggravating circumstances that could be added on to bring a death penalty charge. I think you agree that safety is not a legitimate reason for the death penalty to be implemented.
Nor is deterrence.
Correct. And David, you would agree with that?
I don't think there's any justification for the death penalty, so anything that Robert excludes as a justification, I'm going to agree with.
Right. Are there any other areas where you think you can find some agreement?
Sure, I know.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of areas where we could find some agreement. I think that I think that where Robert and I disagree to a large extent can be summarized. There are two general categories of where we disagree to a large extent. One simply has to do with who it is that ought to be making a moral judgment that he and I might both agree as individuals is a sound moral judgment. And he thinks that's the responsibility of the state, and I don't. I think that's one very important and perhaps the most important area of disagreement. I think the other area of disagreement that is operating a little more subtly in this conversation that he and I have been having today has to do with the way that the theoretical either justification for or objection to the death penalty actually interacts with the world in which we actually live. I mean, I've been down here in Texas as a death penalty lawyer for 25 years now, and Robert describes a world that is simply not the world that I see. I mean, in Texas, for example, prosecutors are not to any significant extent making decisions about which cases to prosecute on the basis of either the preferences of the family of the murder victim, or for that matter, anybody outside of the district attorney's office. In Harris County, there is significant racial disparity within the county. In Dallas County, significant racial disparity within the county until the mid-1980s. Until the mid-1980s. Think about this. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office was still publishing a manual that told district attorneys to keep blacks, Jews, Italians. I mean, the manual used epithets for all of those ethnic categories, but was telling prosecutors to take all of those ethnicities off of juries. And so I think that even when there is significant conceptual or theoretical or moral agreement between Robert's view and mine, I still think that we simply view the world in a very fundamentally different way.
Well, I'd like to identify some more common ground. Highly competent defense counsel are fundamentally necessary and deeply valued and should be celebrated. People like David, who started the Texas Innocence Project and has been a leading defense attorney and a dogged one, and makes certain that in the penalty phase that the killer will be humanized and presented as a human being, and that everything that can be turned up in favor of that person will be presented. The quality of defense counsel is uneven across the United States, and it is fundamentally necessary, if we're going to have punishments this serious and severe, that we both adequately fund and fully appreciate and support the efforts of people like Professor Dow. And so I'm very grateful to him for what he does. I urge that we have a higher burden of persuasion for the death penalty than we do ordinarily for other crimes. A proof beyond a reasonable doubt is the appropriate burden of persuasion at the guilt phase in a death penalty trial and at the guilt phase in all other trials. But that's not a high enough burden of persuasion, in my view, at the penalty phase, where the jury has the simple question of does he live or does he die. The question at the guilt phase is, did he do it? And there it should be rational, and it should be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty. But at the penalty phase, where the question is, does he deserve it? Not did he do it, but what does he deserve? Which is a moral question. It is not a factual question, but a moral question. The burden of persuasion should be higher in two respects. Number one, if a jury has a residual doubt, a doubt that is real but not particularly rational, for which they cannot give a reason, but it's nevertheless real, they should be instructed that they should act on it. That is, that a residual doubt should be enough to preclude the death penalty. The United States Supreme Court has disagreed, and I think they're wrong on that. And even that's not enough. They should have to be convinced not only beyond a residual doubt that he did it, but to a moral certainty that he deserves it. So I would increase the burden of persuasion. I know a fortiori, as David has pointed out, since he's against the death penalty, any way that I propose that makes it more difficult to get it, he supports. So I know that's common ground. Furthermore, there is something called a Declaration of Life. I don't know if it's common down in Texas, but some abolitionist groups have been circulating it, in which you sign a statement saying, in effect, if I am ever killed, if I am ever murdered, no matter what the set of circumstances are, I do not want my killer to get the death penalty. And most proponents of the death penalty scoff at that, and no court has ever admitted into evidence that I know of, and I think that's a mistake. I think the Declaration of Life should count. I think we should be concerned with what the victim wanted. If we went for the death penalty for Gandhi's assassin, for example, that would be a huge mistake. That would be defiling what Gandhi stood for. God forbid if somebody should murder David, and knowing his views against the death penalty, even if the aggravating circumstances were met. It seems to me any prosecutor should pause long and hard before going for the death penalty, knowing that if he were alive, David would fundamentally oppose the death penalty for his killer. That should count. And then finally, though, in terms of our disagreement, Yes, there is a divide between us as to the nature of justice, the importance of punishment, not for the purposes it will serve in the future, but for the fact that the past counts, and for a covenant that we make with our fellow citizens now, some of whom are dead, and that is that our approach will be appropriate and just. And if you don't understand and support punishment because of the past and because it's deserved, then I don't understand how you can support ultimately celebrating the good deeds of those who do them, who are no longer of use to us or any benefit to society. And we still celebrate them for the same and reciprocal reason, because the past counts. It's partly a function of their effort and their attitude. So the best of our best we celebrate, and the worst of the worst of the worst we should punish, and for the same kinds of reciprocal reasons.
David, if you have a response to that, we can let you have the last word.
I think that Robert did a beautiful job of articulating areas that we agree, and I'm very, very grateful to him for the kind words. And if you, as I've said before, if people are interested in reading a sophisticated justification or defense of the death penalty system, there is no better place than Robert's book. All that I would say, I just want to say one thing about his final point, which is that I think that we should celebrate the deeds that good people accomplish, and I think that we should condemn the deeds that bad people do. But condemnation of bad deeds doesn't require that we kill people who do bad things.
All right.
If I get the phone.
Robert, if you want to get one more in, why not?
Well, it's not just one hand washing the other. David kindly said about the death of punishment, if you want to see a sophisticated defense of it based upon years inside prison and much thought. But if you want to see the most beautiful book that I've ever read, that is a love poem to his child and explains the dedication and devotion of those who oppose the death penalty and defend those who are facing it, I urge you to read David Dowd's Autobiography of an Execution. It's absolutely a beautiful piece of work. It's very moving. And regardless of how you feel about the death penalty, I think it should be read and taken very seriously.
Great. And we will provide links underneath the video to those works. Thank you, David and Robert, for a really interesting debate, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in.
Thanks, Aryeh, for hosting this. Thanks a million, Robert. It was fun.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
Bye,
Aryeh.
everybody.
Great.